Hi, guys. I'm Katie Kiersey, and I run marketing here at Right Side Up. And today we're going to be digging into podcast advertising and how brands who invest in the channel can use it to grow their business. And very pleased to introduce you to today's speaker, Krystina Rubino. Krystina is the GM of her offline marketing practice, which she started to help companies strategically allocate their media investments, hold offline channels accountable to customer acquisition goals, and train their internal teams on old and nascent mediums alike, such as podcast, radio, and over-the-top television.
All right. Well, I will endeavor to live up to that introduction. Love working with amazing humans like Katie here at Right Side Up. So we are going to, though, cover podcast advertising, how brands invest in this channel to grow their business. So again, this is going to have more of a performance and growth lens. We're Right Side Up. You know how we do. And also what to do and what not to do to set yourselves up for success. Let's just get into what are podcasts. Podcasts at their core are on-demand audio. When you think about it, podcast advertising is one of the only channels that you will buy that is an on-demand channel, meaning that it's not broadcast. It is essentially purchased or essentially downloaded and then listened to over time, right? If you listen to podcasts yourself, you probably are not sitting there waiting for the next episode of Crime Junkie to come out. You're gonna maybe bank a couple of episodes and then listen to them as you, drive 10 and a half hours with your husband and your dog when you move from the Bay Area to Las Vegas. Definitely not a personal example. And when we think about the way that podcasts are accessed by consumers, they are not hosted by Apple or Google, et cetera. They are hosted via RSS feed, working with different podcasters, work with different platforms like Libsyn, Simplecast, et cetera. The feeds themselves are indexed by Apple and Google, and now also Spotify, right? So when you think about the big platforms, I would say Apple and Spotify really right up there. Apple has obviously, they're called podcasts. Apple has historically been the dominant player in this space. But, companies like SoundCloud, Spotify, Pandora, Google, et cetera, are also indexing these feeds. And then there's also your third-party apps like Overcast and Pocket Cast. This means that there isn't one closed platform or one open exchange where you can buy and sell and transact on media in this channel, right? This isn't Meta where you could just log into Ad Center and go hog wild, right? It's not a closed platform. And so when we think about how podcasts are measured, this is actually one of the challenges in the medium. They're not measured by Nielsen or Kantar, MRI. Apple, as you may or may not be familiar, not really the most open about privacy. In fact, or at least, they're open about their consumers' privacy. They are not open when it comes to sharing consumer data, even anonymized. So there's a information asymmetry that exists in the space that is challenging for advertisers, because also, unlike digital display, for example, there is no third-party ad serving that's available due to technological limitations in distribution. There are some solutions that have been worked on, but very much they are not widely adopted by enough platforms, networks, publishers, independents in the space as to be usable. And also demographic surveys are interesting, but they often represent too small of a percent of the medium. We've actually in the past, when one partner had their demographic survey results live that you could actually go and look at them, a bunch of us took our laptops and decided to just go crazy on demographic data. Hey, I have 2 dogs, 1 kid, a bird. I make $700,000 a year, whatever. We skewed a podcast measurable audience in real time. So I was okay, I can only take this data and look at it so far, right? So we like to look at self-reported data from networks. We also look at tools like Magellan and Podscribe, et cetera, for discovery validation, right? Looking to see which shows are renewed by advertisers, et cetera. And you might just be at this point, half tuning out, all right, if we don't know who is listening and we don't know what they're doing, why would we give this channel money, right? And the answer is, it's all about the endorsement, and it's all about measuring results in a way that jives with the rest of your marketing mix, methodology, attribution modeling, et cetera, right? So the way that the channel has historically worked is reads are either baked in or embedded in an episode, or now something called faked in, which is basically just dynamically inserted ads that are flighted in such a way and embedded in such a way that they mimic the authentic, like, live host-read experience. People actually love these ads. There are YouTube compilations out there. Bill Burr is always the one that comes to mind for me. But some of these videos of ads, now ads, mind you, not ads that we have paid to place in a video. Consumers, listeners cut the ads and have a YouTube compilation of them because they love them and are delighted by them. They have hundreds of thousands, even millions of views. That is not something that people are doing for a display banner or an Instagram reel from a brand. That's just not something that happens. So there's a real earned media component to podcast advertising that when it's done right, it will resonate long after your campaign has stopped, both because the ads are embedded themselves and also because they're memorable. Perhaps you've heard of MailChimp or MailChimp, as it were. So the other part of it, from a measurability perspective, download windows have also been standardized by the AIB. There is still a lot of room to grow here from like a how we're buying this, but by and large, most of the publishers and networks that we work with are usually on like a 45 to 60 day window, reporting estimated downloads to us, and are usually very well accountable to that number. And again, for performance advertisers, listen, you can estimate downloads and impressions until the cows come home, but ultimately I know what that spot is worth to me, right? I know what CPM is going to be tenable for me when it comes to dynamically inserted ads, for example. So really, there's a lot of power in performance advertisers' hands. And the way that we've historically like structured ads in this medium as an industry, very basic, pre, mid, and post, right? This is still 90%, 95% plus of the sponsorship dollars that are changing hands in this medium are changing hands by purchasing some combination of these ad units. Now, I will say, if you're paying for post rolls, I'd love to talk to you about that, because please don't. Except in like very rare scenarios, but realistically, post rolls are almost always included either as added value, or what we see a lot is publishers tend to use them to promote other shows. Pre-rolls can be helpful, but more for a brand awareness goal. What you really want when you're trying to move the needle on purchases is a mid-roll. And it's for a couple of reasons. One, it's inherently less skippable. Two, the audience is already engaged. And three, it's a long format ad. We've actually had mid-rolls, now I'm going back a few years, we've had mid-rolls go 15 to 20 minutes. So think about that. You're contracted for a 60-second mid-roll, and you will have regularly ads that are going 2, 3, 4 minutes. There's something really special about that. It starts to feel very organic. It's still attributed, right? We're not going to get in trouble with the FCC or the FTC, but it feels more organic than just like a 30 to 45 second produced spot. So when it comes to think about like great candidates for podcast advertising, the bread and butter of this channel for a very long time now has been direct to consumer e-commerce. If you want to sell toothbrushes, sheets, mattresses, etc., directly to consumers, this is literally one of the best channels that you can use for your brand, because again, if people haven't heard of you, they've heard of the host that's reading for your brand, right? That for me is, there's so much trust that gets transferred from the host to the brand that really helps you jump the hurdle when it comes from like awareness to purchase consideration, intent, et cetera, all the way to purchase. That's why I say a lot of the times like nascent brands do really well in this medium. If you think about brands like ZipRecruiter and Squarespace, they really use this channel to build credibility for their brand. And they will be the first ones to tell you that it helped them build up their brand into a household name or close to a household name. Products that require consumer education do really well. Again, due to the long form nature of reads, people who can speak in a qualified way, like they understand the product, or better yet, they use the product. Like we've worked with a lot of products that really are new, like they're category definers or category creators. And it's a lovely thing when creators are given the space to really talk about a product, its benefits, et cetera. Advertisers who have already scaled other paid acquisition channels will do better in this channel. For me, when I speak to brands and they're like, oh, we only just launched Meta 2 weeks ago, I'm like, you're not ready for this. I want you to break and fix things in other channels before you think about starting podcast advertising. It should not be the first paid marketing channel in your media mix. it's really better if you scale paid search or paid social first, because you will have conversion rate optimized landing pages. You will have broken parts of your funnel and had to put in dev tickets to Jira that, had to get resolved before you could really scale up that channel spend. All of those learnings, all of that time, dev, product, and all of that stuff, that will all translate beautifully to a more successful podcast advertising campaign. The other part is, and this is more rare today, but advertisers who are first to market in a competitive category, you will do very well. Again, ZipRecruiter, Squarespace. Even if you're not first, but you are more progressed on the way from like a category perspective, but the other people in your category haven't diversified to this channel yet, you will clean house. Again, if you have a few other things, we'll talk about this later, but like if you have product market fit, you have an optimized funnel, you have landing pages, you have some of the basics done, you will do very, very well in this channel. Brands that are more likely to struggle, advertisers who are later to the medium in those saturated categories. Like if you are trying to sell a mattress in the year of Our Lady Kelly Clarkson 2023, you're going to have a hard time in podcast advertising. That earth has been largely scorched. It can be done. You will still find some pockets where you're going to not be able to open genres because they are locked to you by an advertiser that's already spent, et cetera. Products or services where you have regional versus national availability. There are some exceptions here. If your products are in most major DMAs, major metros, you can do okay here. This also has gotten better over the years with geo-targeted advertising being more commonplace and more scaled and capable. But candidly, if you're only available in a few DMAs, I would tell you that there are other channels to pursue first. Again, besides the usual digital counterparts. And when you have CPG, but you don't have a D2C component, brick and mortar measurement, again, this is also like ties into brick and mortar retail. It's really challenging when it comes to, frankly, when it comes to translating results from channels like this, again, unless you're doing something where it's like traditional CPG, brands with a capital B, where you're doing like a Millward Brown 9 box once a year, you're doing some sort of like quarterly awareness tracker. When you've got that really dialed in, that's a little different, but most brands do not have that kind of market research and measurement spend. I've only worked on a couple in my career that have that kind of media mix measurement model, that whole spiel. So my recommendation is usually to either use this as an opportunity to build up that measurement capability, or again, think about other channels, right? Like think about channels like linear television or channels that are like you will feel and be able to see reported through your various retail partners, uplift and uptick in sales. The last part is products with older demographics. Again, struggle, not impossible, right? The podcast audience is aging, so this is changing. I would say in a couple of years, this is going to be like 65 plus instead of 55 plus. But if you have older demographics, you're probably better off doing, when it comes to audio, doing national terrestrial radio, local terrestrial radio, linear television. When it comes to video, you are better off finding that audience in the channels that they most frequently consume versus trying to make fetch happen in podcasting. Speaking of a podcast audience, what does that look like? Well, believe it or not, we are still in the early majority of adopters. So a little over 40% of the US population has listened to a podcast in the past month. What's really cool is that of the people who listen at least once per week, they listen to 4 or more podcasts a week. So 2 things to consider there. One, when you are buying like run of network, which is a tactic in the quiver, but it's not something that I personally recommend a brand really like launches with or makes a huge portion of their media spend. Part of it is because of this and because frequency capping is not yet widely available, especially on a time-based frequency cap in the medium. And the other part of it is, it's really cool. You start to be able to establish frequency with different hosts when you take into account like the listening habits of different consumers. The opportunity here is to accumulate reach and frequency via multiple shows, multiple hosts. And that starts to be, when you start to scale your podcast program, this is where this comes into play, where it starts to be a cumulative effect over time when different influencers are taking different viewpoints and different perspectives on ad reads for you, stuff like that, different audiences too. Who's listening? They skew younger than the average US population. So almost 50% are within ages 12 to 34, most 18 to 34, versus 36% of the general population. Also higher skew 35 to 54. If you look here, this is where the 55 comes into play. The adults 55 plus are index about 50 versus 100 index of the US population. So that's where I say caution. But I love this. So the recent Edison 2023 Infinite Dial, they actually said podcast listeners are an advertiser's dream. Compared to the US population, monthly podcast listeners are more affluent, they're more employed, and they're more educated. And so what this means, especially when you're thinking about selling a good that is not a need rather than a want, right? If you're trying to reach an informed consumer who, for example, is making different choices about her body, right? Like wants to put better things in so that she gets better results out. Like I think about a brand like Athletic Greens that has done really, really well in this medium. You look at the slide and you're like, oh yeah, 2 + 2 = 5 in this case, right? It's audience fit, brand fit, and the host can really get behind a product. Like, and also the team there is incredible. We don't work with them. I love their team. But they are, that's one example of a brand that's been able to come in and find success because they overlap so neatly with the demographics of the channel. When we think about how to actually get into and plan and execute a podcast advertising campaign, it's going to look a lot like other channels that you've executed. I like to say media are a set of transmission tools. Katie kind of hinted at this, but I have an omni-channel background. So I actually in a past life launched a couple of trading desks. I was an early adopter of DSPs when it came to the digital display, like evolution into programmatic buying. So when I say like, it's like other campaigns and other mediums that you've worked in, it is like other campaigns and mediums that you've worked in. There's just always going to be a little extra flavor, a little extra spice that diversifies each medium from the other. So when we think about partner research, there's 3 ways that you can go. You can go it in-house, you can work with an agency, or you can work in-house with a consultancy to support like us. When it comes to media planning, this is basically when you think about requests for proposals or RFPs, this is where we RFP the marketplace. We'll reach out to networks, partners, publishers, independent shows. Fun fact, we actually work with, I think independent shows are our 4th largest in aggregate partner. So we still do a lot of work with independents here. We tend to see really great performance from them. So this is where also we'll start our negotiations with partners. When we get into contracting the media placements that we're buying, then we get into creative and onboarding. You're not looking to give the hosts a script. There is nothing worse than when it's like, hello, I am reading this ad for Right Side Up. Like no one cares. That you can just immediately tell that people are unengaged. The host has never seen your copy before, which is always one of my favorite ones. When I hear them start to read like, please pick one intro. Oh, you don't want that to happen. What you're trying to do is get out of the way of the host so that they could speak openly in a qualified manner about your product or service. So this also is where the host onboarding process is super important. When we think about the way that we're working with hosts, and now it's a little harder now. We used to actually get on the phone with hosts back in the day, 5 or 6 years ago. We'll still get on the phone with some hosts, but a lot of the times we're talking to producers, talking to sales staff or support like campaign management staff, and we're helping them understand the products and its benefits because they are probably in the room when the reads are happening. Actually, Giancarlo Bizzarro from Crooked Media has a great story. He's often in the room with the guys who record the ads for Pod Save America, et cetera. And he is constantly giving them creative direction. They had a tweet go viral for everything that he edited out. So it just shows you it's a really collaborative process between all of the people who work at a network or publisher. When it comes to measurement, this is where, if you've ever listened to a podcast ad, since I'm on the crooked bend, I'll just keep going. You may or may not have heard, the boys who do Pod Save America be like, hey, go to brooklinen.com/crooked, and you'll get X amount off of your Y purchase. So that is where primarily you'll see a lot of brands in the space capturing direct activity through a vanity URL, or go to download the DoorDash app and use code crooked for blah, blah, blah. This is also that's where they'll capture direct response. Then we think about capturing indirect response. There's a bevy of ways that we'll get into later where you could do that. And then is when the work really starts. When you get media off the ground and you launch, then it's about monitoring the spots, making sure that they are, injected on time, that they are hitting the brand's yeses, that they aren't hitting the brand's no's, that you're working over time to optimize the way that media is performing, optimizing reads over time, and then you're iteratively scaling, right? I'll get into it here. This is kind of like what a launch timeline looks like. 6 weeks is probably on the longer side for us. I tend to tell people that 6 weeks is, if you have many hands in the creative process, then probably 5 to 6 weeks. If you are in a regulated industry like financial tech, liquor, healthcare, then you will probably be on the longer side. Conversely, if you're a really small, like modest size seed to Series A, D to C, with a modest marketing team and modest budgets, you could probably get live in 3 to 4 weeks. So it's a bit of a gamut, but this is, when you look at this, just to lay it out in a Gantt, this is kind of the steps of the process that I just outlined over a time period. And then, like I said, launch week is kind of where the work really starts of making sure that the campaign is actually working. When it comes to ad lengths, they vary, but mid-rolls are the ad unit to beat. The way that we typically buy the channel is one of two ways. Either it's on a spot cost basis, meaning that it's an estimated number of downloads multiplied by a CPM, and that is how you get your fixed spot cost, or it's on impressions, which are also downloads. You're basically paying per impression, you're paying per 1,000 impressions CPM or cost per mille. There are pros and cons to each approach. It's been rare that I have not had an embedded spot over deliver over a long period of time, right? They might have some soft delivery in that like 45-day window, but usually when spots are embedded in perpetuity, it's not really a question of if they'll hit delivery, it's when. And then on the other end of it, impression-based ads are good for brands where like they might want to change up messaging frequently. They need more flexibility in the way that they're ad serving, et cetera. When it comes to flighting, we tend to recommend flighting every 3 weeks. And now this changes a little bit based on dynamic insertion, but basically what you're trying to do here is capitalize on media consumption pattern of the channel. There's a fine line between saturating and oversaturating, right? You want enough frequency for people to be able to be like, oh, I know that brand, and not too much frequency so that you're like, ugh, I know that brand. So there's a dance where you try to figure out the optimal share of voice for a flight. There are some exceptions to this rule. Like sometimes with bigger shows, we'll flight 1x4. Sometimes when we're in like Q5 for a fintech brand, we'll flight 1x2. We'll flight closer together just because, again, we're trying to capitalize on seasonality, et cetera. So really depends. Where are we at with programmatic and podcasting? I have and can do an entire hour talk on this. The TLDR is that we are still in the relative beginning of ad monetization via these kinds of technology first solutions. On our site, I did a whole talk on programmatic last year at Podcast Movement, and I compared and contrasted the adoption of this technology in podcasting to the way that it has been adopted and used in digital advertising. And it is vastly different. The time frame for it is a little more condensed, right? So when we think about networks rose in prominence between 2012 and 2016. And what that really helped to do was aggregate the buying pool for buyers like myself, agency buyers, brands, et cetera. We didn't have even a DSP in the space until Panoply became Megaphone in 2018. And then they sold to Spotify in 2020 or 2021. So when you think about it, we are now at the point where we have the opportunity to work with a DSP like the Trade Desk, for example, to place ads in podcasts themselves. Candidly, the way I like to explain this to most advertisers is that when you do that, you are buying my leftovers. You are buying the podcasts and shows that don't make our cut to be monetized, because we buy regularly somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 shows. I would say in any given calendar year, we're probably buying 10,000 shows, something like that. And so there are millions of podcasts out there. Most of them do not meet the hurdle for monetization, or they do not fall within the parameters of what I would consider like a solid buy. Basically, there's going to be an evolution here. And because we aren't yet at the point where we have RTB or real-time bidding, we don't have an open exchange. Again, we don't have the ability to do time-based frequency caps. When it comes to audience targeting, the same challenges that you're having in Meta are going to also happen here, except even more so because it's not a closed platform that we're buying on. So when brands come in and they want to do like, I just want to buy it programmatically and I want to give Spotify X amount of money, I'm like, yeah, that's not podcast advertising though. It's you're advertising on podcasts, but when it comes to for want of a better word, the playbook for how DR brands have successfully scaled this medium, you're not doing it. That is not the same thing. What is good about dynamic insertion, it allows us to be a little more immediate and a little more adaptable about creative, because ads are stitched into the podcast episode at the time of download. The difference here is dynamic insertion is ad insertion technology. It's not a buying mechanism. It's just the technology. There's nothing wrong with the technology. The challenges come in the ways that publishers and networks are applying the technology to their catalog, if that makes sense. What is cool though, it allows us to like serve different creative to different listeners. Like this is the start of the advent and application of digital ad serving technology to our channel. When it comes to setting expectations for investment in the channel, what do you get for your money? I very often now say, I don't often recommend that brands start under 75,000 for like a 3-month campaign. Couple of reasons. The biggest one being shows are just larger than they used to be. And brands are also spending more on media usually before they come to this channel. So when it comes to a first test, there's a couple of hurdles we're trying to clear. What we're trying to do is, one, we want to test enough dollars that it's meaningful and we can spread across a decent number of genres. We actually at Right Side Up have recategorized genres because society and culture is so broad as to be meaningless. Like, thank you, iTunes, but I don't even know what that means. So we have recategorized every show that we buy into one of about 100 verticals. And so it's like female aspirational is going to be different than female advice, than female lifestyle. True crime has different flavors. Like, what's your poison? Is it murder? Is it cults? Like, it's a very, what you really want to do when you're testing into the channel is find your verticals, find your areas or arenas or avenues, whatever, where you find success and you expand there, right? So it's about finding what works, cutting what doesn't. And for first-time advertisers in the medium, you can probably expect to see payback in the first flight, like meaning $1 ROAS or better from somewhere between, I would say industry average is around 25 to 30%. Not to toot our own horn, but Right Side Up is usually somewhere in the vicinity of like 35, 40% plus. And the magic number is 50. When it comes to like just immediate proof positive, like LFG, let's go. If you hit 50% or over of the first show, like the first batch of test shows that you're like, oh, I should renew these tomorrow. These are already hitting my goals without even really much optimization. This channel is right for you. If you're in that like 25 to 40%, this channel is still right for you. We just need to dial in the placements, right? Again, it's like anything else. It's like when you're in AdWords and you're like, oh, this ad group's working really well. That one's not, oh, this creative is really outperforming the other ones. I should probably bring this creative to other ad groups, et cetera. The same way you optimize placements on other channels, that's what we're going to do here. Ideal podcast creative. We made up a fake company. It's called Fly, F.ly. It is the latest in carrier pigeon technology. And when we think about the way that we structured ads, here in this example for Fly, we like to provide brief talking points about the brand. Your entire ad copy points, essentially, like that entire file, should actually fit on one page. You want to leave room for ad lib. You don't want to make it so it would sound weird if the host reads it verbatim, right? You still want it to have some flow to it. The way that we approach copy is very formulaic, not meaning that it's the same every time, meaning we have like a formula for it. We usually give them a couple of intros. The art of the long form letter might be dead, but that doesn't mean you need to abandon the personal touch altogether. If you're looking to send a meaningful message with speed and style, try fly. But you could see it's like a way to get into the copy. And then you get into brand facts, all of the information that people need in order to buy today, tomorrow, basically to immediately start considering your brand if they're in the market for a similar product or service. And then you want to close with multiple iterations of your call to action, right? If you listen to podcast ads, you know that usually people are repeating it 2 to 3 times. That is generally, we like to have people repeat the call to action at some point in the ad 3 times. That is the magic number for people to actually retain it. But when we think about the anatomy of the copy, this is it. Getting into attribution. The way to go in this medium is multiple methodologies that overlap, because there is not one tried and true, you can use this methodology of measurement, but you never have to look at a different methodology of measurement. Unfortunately, I'm very sorry to say, that is not the case. I have never heard somebody just be like, oh, you know what? Like, I only use survey-based methodology and period, it's all I use. Or I only use pod sites. That's really all I use. I only use direct. You really want to have multiple methodologies because it allows you to triangulate the story, not the story in like, we're going to tell fanciful stories about the data, but the story of how media is performing and how you can actually translate that against other channels. So what does direct attribution tell us? When we think about direct attribution, it tells us part of the story. It is not all, it is an indicator. When you think about last click attribution, it only captures response from about 20%, 20 to 30% if you're lucky, of users who are being exposed to your ad and converting. And so what this winds up doing is it creates noise in your MMM. It means that you're not optimizing accurately, right? Just because somebody doesn't, for example, follow the path to action from one show doesn't mean that they weren't impacted by that show and ultimately converted based on that. It's the same way that when you look at performance and meta, there's view through attribution on a certain window. The ability to measure in direct attribution is basically us trying to create a parallel to view through attribution for this medium. When you measure just on direct activity, you're probably missing between 70 to 80% of offline activity. And so when we think about survey is one of the ways that I like to tell brands to start. And often, especially post iOS 14.5, with data deprecation, with cookies actually being deprecated sometime next year by Google, I think this methodology is going to become even more omnipresent in marketers' toolkits, essentially. So it's you're probably very familiar with it. It's how'd you hear about us, right? There's a few different ways that you want to make sure that when you're administering a survey for the purpose of media measurement, triangulation, et cetera, what you're trying to do there is eliminate bias. So you want to randomize your choices. You want to keep it short. And then you also want to do baseline removal. Even though you may not have advertised on a podcast, I guarantee you, either some host has mentioned you somewhere or some consumer, bless them, is like, I heard about this on a podcast. You're like, no, you didn't. You want to remove baseline because, again, what that gives you is more faith in the methodology and its application to your business. When it comes to how survey-based attribution is calculated, again, you're not throwing out direct attribution, right? You are taking your direct URL or promo attribution. You are adding indirect attribution, and that's how you get a fully attributed picture. And so this is what it looks like. Basically, when you're looking at overall signups from the survey, you are extrapolating the survey responses from podcast. You are then applying that to your known or direct podcast signups. And then you're using that to figure out what your multiplier is, or what your ROAS is. There's a bunch of different ways that you can do this. But the TLDR is that what winds up happening is when you compare and contrast this style of attribution with last click, you see here, again, channels like paid search and paid social are incredible. They are demand capturers. They are not demand generators. Channels like podcast, linear television, terrestrial radio, these are demand generators. And when we think about survey-based attribution, this basically just helps us even the playing field between channels that don't have breakage, like paid search, and channels that have a ton of breakage, like podcasts. Because often when you're listening to a podcast, you are not sitting there and being like, oh, I can't wait to write my URL in so that I can follow it. You're probably like cooking dinner or getting ready for the day, or you're on a run and you're not going to like stop what you're doing and pick up your phone. So this is why using some sort of indirect methodology really, really helps paint a full picture. It doesn't have to be survey. It can be, so often we will enable a tool like Podsights, ArtsAI, Claritas, et cetera, to enable server-side and pixel-based attribution. There are some challenges with this methodology of attribution. So it's not the sole one that we will rely on, but it is a tool in the toolbox. We also use historical data as baseline to measure lift. Again, this is where when you don't want to use a survey or you can't administer a survey for some reason, let's just say you're an app and there's a dev backlog and you can't get it in yet. There are other ways that you can look at this channel and say, okay, here are some of the ways that I can try and triangulate indirect attribution without creating a lot of dev costs. My personal favorite way to attribute for, I would say, 8 or 9 out of 10 of the companies we work with is a combination of survey, Podsights or other pixel-based server-side attribution. And ideally, if the brand is doing any kind of first-party research or first-party panel, anything like that, that is super, super helpful in addition to these other methodologies to say, what actually made you buy us? What made you finally click the button and sign up or, or add to cart or whatever? You can use multipliers from other offline channels, imperfect for obvious reasons, but if you need to in a pinch, you can look at channels like direct mail or even like match market methodology from radio and say, okay, this is what happens when breakage is in the mix. We can probably assume that there will be a similar level of breakage, et cetera, et cetera. Again, that's a leap of faith approach. I like to call myself a reformed brand marketer. So I don't like that approach. I want to look at the data and I want to know how much my media is actually driving for me. The pros and cons, podcast advertising can be a game changer for brands and companies who want to acquire customers who last. What's really cool is that they can reach and motivate niche customers. This channel can help open up audiences that you may find cost prohibitive to target in other channels, or you might be like, oh, I never thought about targeting gamers for my brand. I've really been focusing on, millennial moms or suburban moms. You can establish category exclusivity and block out competitors. We have done this successfully for many of our brands where it would be really, really hard for a new brand to come in and make a foothold. And again, the host endorsement nature of this channel is just so valuable. It gives your brand credibility and is one of the only channels I've ever worked in that matches linear television for brand favorability and brand metrics that are, that you could see a measurable lift over baseline. The cons, it's a really manual channel. We have specialized consultants who spend a ton of time working with our partners to buy the right inventory, the right mix of shows, the right tactics, all of that stuff in this channel. The challenge is really, it's the manual nature of this. It's also the information asymmetry. Historically, a few agencies have controlled a lot of the narrative and a lot of the information in this channel. That was one of the biggest motivators for me in starting this practice because I was in-house right before this. And I had also worked at an agency in the space. I was just like, why can't everybody know what I know? Let's even the playing field a little bit. Because again, I believe the best work is done by empowered in-house marketers, whether they're consultants or whether they're full-time. I think the best work happens when you're treating channels like this as a partnership channel and you're really coming at it from an in-house bend. And just closing on whether or not you and your company are ready for podcast advertising, we want to make sure you have a stable user flow. I have broken supply chains. I've crashed websites. Again, there's like a certain flex in that, but when you can avoid it, let's avoid it, right? let's not create chaos if we can avoid it. You want to have scaled another marketing channel, ideally another paid marketing channel. You're looking to have a conversion rate optimized landing page. You also want to have enough meaningful budget, again, somewhere between 75 to 150 over 7 to 10 weeks. A lot of agencies will tell you need $250,000 per quarter. I am here to tell you, no, that is not the case. A lot of them actually have that minimum because they're trying to back into a certain amount of fee, which again, it's just their business model. They're trying to back into a certain amount of fee to ensure the engagement is profitable for them. It has nothing to do with the actual media spend that's necessary to understand whether or not this is a channel that you should continue investing in. We really want to make sure you have indirect attribution methodology established. You want to have internal bandwidth for asset creation, right? We might need 20 or 30 landing pages created. If that's something that is going to bury your dev team, again, there's ways that you can work around it, but you just might want to earmark that like there's going to be some internal bandwidth required for this. When it comes to realistic expectations for results, again, because of the on-demand nature of podcast advertising or podcasts themselves and the way they're consumed, it's going to take weeks, maybe even months to see the results from channel because you're not seeing that media consumption happen all at once, right? So then you're not just going to see results happen overnight. There's going to be your purchase funnel that has to be taken into account as well.
Thanks so much for tuning in. For those of you who aren't familiar with Right Side Up, we're a collective of marketing specialists who have helped more than 600 companies hit their growth goals. We have expertise across all marketing channels, including performance, lifecycle, SEO, social, analytics, creative, and more. Have a growth challenge that needs solving? We'd love to chat. Reach out to us at rightsideup.com.